Hey everyone, Jonas here from the Spinoza Rod Company. Today we're going to take a closer look at the Bogdan salmon reel. If you know anything about classic reels, Bogdan is a name that needs no introduction. Stan Bogdan was arguably the most famous reel maker of the 20th century, one whose reels were revered by anglers in general and by salmon anglers in particular. What we're going to do today is take this reel apart and take a closer look at the famous Bogdan drag system, which was largely responsible for putting the Bogdan name on the map and keeping it there for the better part of 70 years. So let's take a look. Now, here are two Bogdan reels that I grabbed, and the first thing you'll notice, of course, is the iconic S-handle design. This style of reel was made famous by Edward vom Hoff, one of the preeminent reel makers of the late 19th and early 20th century, and he's the one who started this S-handle style design. So called, of course, for the graceful serpentine S-handle on the outside of the reel. Now, vom Hoff's reels were largely made from German silver and hard rubber, the best available materials at the time. Bogdan, coming a generation later, utilized aluminum, which was far lighter, and all of his salmon reels are machined from the material. They typically came in a couple of different colors. These two here are what I would call champagne and black. They have a slightly warmer, sort of champagne colored frame. But Bogdan also did them in a full black, black frame and a black spool, like this one here. He also did them in a gold color, which was done at the request of his early retailers, like this one here. And of course, the silver and black color combination, which tends to be the most popular among Bogdan aficionados today. You can see it's got the sort of classic, silver frame and black, nice black side plates. Now, Bogdan aficionados can often spot a Bogdan reel a mile away, and the reason for that is often due to this Bogdan nameplate right here on the outside of the reel. And to some extent, the drag adjuster here at the bottom, which has a kind of a signature Bogdan look to it. That drag adjuster moves back and forth with a little click at each stop, and as we'll see in a minute, can take the drag from relatively light to incredibly strong in short order. The inbound and outbound retrieves on Bogdans have a nice, satisfying click to them. We'll give this one a little bit of a crank here. They're not as loud as some other classic reels on the market, but they have a solidness to them that I really like. Of course, it's the drag mechanism itself which made them famous, and we'll take a look at that right now. Now, a few tips when it comes to taking apart a Bogdan. I know some folks are reluctant to take apart an expensive reel like this. Totally understandable. So my first tip is to do it when you have a clear head and a steady hand. Taking it apart at your tying bench when you've had a bit of your favorite single malt may not be the best time, tempting though it is, or when you're in a place where you can't really concentrate that easily. The second tip I have is to have the right tools. We've got some hollow ground bits that we've made up that fit perfectly into the screws on Bogdans and are great for getting a good, even pressure on them. One of the things that we see a lot when reels come into the shop is that the screw heads here have been pretty chewed up, often because someone just grabbed whatever screwdriver they had handy, and it really wasn't a great fit for those screws right there. Now, the right tool doesn't have to be a fancy gunsmithing bit, however. Bogdan famously machined the slots in these screws to fit a Canadian dime. So if you had one handy, or if you have one handy, that may very well do the trick. Of course, the old saw was that if you had just purchased a Bogdan, a dime was probably all you had left anyway. So let's go ahead and get these screws loosened up. Okay, Now, once you have the screws loosened up a bit, you might think that you would be able to just pull the spool right out. But if you try that, you're going to be at it quite a while. And that's because the screws on Bogdan reels aren't designed to come all the way out. And while that might seem a little bit odd, it's actually pretty smart. Say you want to change out spools on the riverbank, for example. The last thing you want to do is lose one of those screws in the river or among some stones and just never be able to find it again. So I find that the best way to do this is, after I've loosened them, is to pinch the 3 loosened screws at the same time and sort of push them all towards the center of the spindle. And then usually if I turn the reel over, that spool will slide right out. Now, before we dive into the drag, there's one more thing to note about this reel, which is that it has a multiplying retrieve. And a multiplier in this case, it's a 2-to-1 multiplier, just means that for every 1 revolution of the crank, you get 2 revolutions of the spool. And if you pull the spool off of the crank plate here, you'll see the gears that are responsible for that. I'll get them good and close. Now, not all Bogdans are multipliers, but most of them are. And even though that adds a little bit of weight to the reel, I generally prefer multipliers. If you've ever had a really big fish take off downriver on you and then, having run out a bunch of line, turn right back around and head towards you, it's really handy to be able to get that line back in quickly. One little tip here about the multiplier piece is that you don't actually have to take the reel apart in order to see whether it's a multiplier. You can, of course, simply count the revolutions. You can turn the crank and sort of take a look at how many times the spool turns around. That's pretty easy. But there's actually an even easier way, which is just to look at the width of each side of the frame right here. Because to accommodate that gear, that multiplier gear, the reel simply needs a little bit of extra width on the cranking side right here. So if you take a look at this reel and you compare it to a single action Bogdan, like this one over here, obviously these are different size reels, but you'll notice there's a pretty big difference in the width of each side of the frame. This one here is just as wide on both sides, but this one here, if you look at it, has a heavy side and sort of a thicker side and a thinner side. So you can tell just right at a glance whether or not you're looking at a multiplier Bogdan or a single action reel. That's a pretty simple way to do that. So let's take a closer look at the Bogdan drag itself. Now, if you stare at this for a minute, you'll probably have some intuitive sense of what's happening here. The drag essentially has 3 parts with a few little additional pieces that we'll get to in a moment. First, we have the central drum right here, this area right here. And the story to this mechanism is that it's really all about direction. And if you look at it closely, you'll actually see that it's not one part, but it's 2 parts, one stacked on top of the other. The first is the large circular drum on the bottom, this big one here with these ported holes that have been put in there to reduce some weight. And then sitting on top of that is this smaller gear right here. So let's take a quick look at that smaller one first. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that this smaller gear has 2 little parts right there and there that stick out of that gear. And those 2 little parts insert into the spool, which has 2 little corresponding slots to receive them. And we're going to get in nice and close here. Let's see if I can do this. And you'll notice that as we turn this gear, it has a little pawl down here to the left, which engages as I turn it. And this is really sort of a standard click and pawl style design. Now, remember that this is going in the dragless direction, the inbound direction. And so what you can't see here is that there's actually a little spring that sits underneath and behind the larger drum, and which keeps this little pawl down here engaged on that. So you'll see it just comes right back into the center every time I click it. So basically what Bogdan has done here is created a simple little click drag which keeps a small amount of fixed pressure on the inbound, the dragless retrieve, to help control any spool overrun. So far, so good. Now, if we switch directions and if we try and rotate this gear in the other direction, it's a different story entirely. So we'll do that right now. What happens is, if we try and twist this, it engages that much larger drum behind it. As we'll see in a second here, this larger drum is where the stopping power of the Bogdan mechanism really comes into play. And what I think is clever about this central mechanism is the way that Bogdan put both of these pieces together in a sensible but also, frankly, a rather elegant kind of design. So that's part one, that's the drum. Now let's go to the second major part of the drag design, the brakes. Now you can probably guess how this works just by looking at it. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's pretty intuitive. On either side of the drum, you've got a brake pad here and a brake pad here. And these are two Delrin brake pads which press directly against that central drum. Earlier Bogdan reels had pads made out of micarta before he switched to Delrin. So if you open up a Bogdan and see that these pads are a brown color instead of white, it means that you have an earlier model. And as you can see, these pads are both pushed in by these large sets of springs, right there, and then right there and right there, that come in from either side. Makes sense. Now, what isn't quite so obvious sometimes is what these little washers do that sit right on top of those brake pads. And actually, at first glance, you'd almost think that they pin the brake pads directly to the side plate of the reel. But that wouldn't make any sense. You don't want those pads fixed, or at least fixed in place. But as it turns out, there's actually a little slot machined into the outer part of the pad, and this sort of pin and washer basically hold the pad in place while also allowing it to slide back and forth. Nice design. And if we follow the springs out, we can see that they are mounted to these brackets. So this bracket right here on the outside. And again, if you looked at it quickly, you'd almost think that these brackets might be mounted to the side plates as well. They have a little screw in the center, and you think, okay, that's sort of held firmly in place. But if you think about it, that wouldn't make any sense either, because we also need these to move too. So what we have with the pads, springs, and the bracket are a balance between stability, making sure that any possible movement is tightly controlled, but they also allow enough of that movement to be able to adjust the force that's transmitted to the central drum. Now this brings us to the third and last part, which is the drag adjustment system itself. Now, as you can see, those brackets that we were just talking about are connected to these large semicircular arms that kind of go around the outside of the reel, right here on that side. They're sort of mirrored on the other side there. And if you follow those arms out to either end, you'll see pretty quickly how the force on this reel is adjusted. Now, if you look at the very top up here, you'll see these arms are held by pins, and these do, in fact, go into the side plates, not floating for once. But if you follow the arms all the way to the other side, all the way down here, you'll see that they end at this cam. And when you move the drag adjuster on the outside of the reel, it's the cam that drag adjuster is turning. And that, in turn, moves both arms in and out. So let's see if we can do that right here. I'll just give it a quick adjustment. So I'm going to move the arm on the outside, and you'll see as I do, it pulls those arms closer to one another, and pretty close actually if you think about it. I haven't done it all the way, and then if I pull it back out, you'll see that it spreads those arms right back out again. Not surprisingly, that is the way that you produce a lot more pressure on that main drum. I can turn a Bogdan drag with some effort at the lowest setting, but if you crank it all the way up, you can forget about doing it with bare hands here without a spool and a handle to crank on. A fun aside, Graydon Hilyard, who wrote the book about the Bogdans, used to have a brass ring that he wore, and mounted to the top of that ring was one of these cams, just like this one right here. I'm not much for jewelry, but that's a ring I can certainly get behind. And that is that. The central drum and gear, the brake pads and springs, and then the drag adjustment system. Those are really the three main components of a Bogdan reel. Now, some of you are probably wondering what this little pawl does. This one right above the drum right here. I don't really consider this to be one of the core features of the reel, but it's still kind of neat. What this little pawl does here is that engages some gear teeth that are machined into the very back side of the central drum. As you can imagine, simply having brake pads press on a smooth drum isn't going to produce any sound. I don't know about you, but I, for one, can't stand not having a nice click on an outgoing reel. It's pleasing, sure, but it also allows you to audibly tell how much line is running out, which is helpful too. So this pawl produces that sound. However, if you, for some silly reason, insist on not having that sound, you can disengage this click by turning this small cam right here that sits right underneath it. There's a little knob on the outside of the reel that does just that. And in fact, for some people, historically, the reason to turn that click off was not silly at all. They needed a little stealth to avoid the warden. So that's why that piece right there is called the poacher's knob. Part of the allure of Bogdans, of course, isn't strictly functional. No one loves the drag design more than I do, believe me. But a big part of what makes these reels special is the care and the craft that goes into making them. These are not reels that were designed in a CAD program, sent out to a machining center somewhere, or any of the other hallmarks of modern mass production. They were made one at a time by an individual craftsman who personally machined every part himself. In fact, when Stan Bogdan began making these reels out of his machine shop in Nashua, New Hampshire in 1955, his initial investment in his machinery, I think, was about $400, which is mind-boggling to contemplate. All of these Bogdan reels, all of the ones that we looked at today and took apart, were made on a Fladler lathe that dated back to the First World War and an ancient Van Norman milling machine. There were few formal schematics or drawings involved, and they took an awfully long time to make. That's part of what makes them so great, and also part of what makes them so rare and so expensive. To me personally, that's also a big part of what makes them special. When you love to fish, there's nothing more fun than fishing with a reel like one of these, where you know how much individual craftsmanship has gone into it. That's true for Bogdans and also true for a number of fantastic classic reels. For me, it really enriches the whole experience of what chasing salmon on the fly is all about. Now, for those of you who have enjoyed this, I also have one other recommendation to make, and that is this book right here. This is a book by Graydon Hilyard about the Bogdans. I mentioned him a little bit earlier a few moments ago. And he's the one who has written the definitive work on the Bogdans and their reels on Stan and on Steve. It's a fantastic read. It's got a bunch of early history of the Bogdan reels and their development. It's got a bunch of great photos of some of the prototypes of the drag and how that played out over time. It's just really interesting. I think it's really interesting. There's also some great correspondence between a number of angling luminaries and Stan. And those angling luminaries, as it turns out, were often waiting for their reels just like the rest of us, which I sort of get a kick out of every time I read it. I actually had the chance last year to spend an afternoon with Graydon and Steve in the shop. And as you can imagine, it was a blast to sit around and talk reels and fishing all afternoon. Graydon also unfortunately passed away just weeks later, and so this book is also a little poignant for me too. And I think of him every time I pick it up. So if you like Bogdan reels or want to learn more about them, I would definitely go out and grab yourself a copy. One more thing I might recommend in addition to the book is that if you enjoyed Bogdan reels and salmon reels, make sure to reach out through our website. We're available at www.spinozarods.com. In addition to building bamboo fly rods here in our shop, we also sell tons of classic fly fishing tackle, including Bogdans, and we'll be happy to try and help if you have a question, if you're looking for one, if you're looking to sell one. Please don't hesitate to drop us a note. And in fact, if you enjoy fine fishing tackle, make sure to sign up for our email list, which goes out to thousands of anglers around the world with new rods and reels and other tackle as it becomes available. The last thing I'll encourage you to do is to sign up for our YouTube channel, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're going to be putting out a bunch of videos just like this one on a variety of different topics related to classic reels and bamboo rods. So if you enjoy this, make sure to subscribe so that you get our future videos as well. And if you know anyone else who would enjoy it, please share it with them. It helps us spread the word. Thanks for watching.